Question 1. Consider an environmental audit of a chemical processing plant that has been operating for 5 years. The audit team collected data on volatile organic compound, VOC emissions from various process vents over the past 12 months, comparing these against the site's permit limits and historical data. The findings indicate that while most individual readings are within the regulated limits, there is a statistically significant positive correlation between increased ambient temperature and higher VOC emission rates from a specific exhaust stack, even when process conditions are held constant. This correlation, though not resulting in a direct permit violation on any single day, suggests a potential systemic issue with the abatement technology's efficiency under certain thermal stress conditions. According to the principles of data analysis for environmental audit reports under ISO 14014-2003, what is the most appropriate way to present and interpret this finding within the audit report to inform the auditee about potential future noncompliance and the need for proactive measures? Option A. Focus solely on the fact that no permit violations occurred during the audit period, concluding that the environmental management system is functioning effectively with respect to VOC emissions, and omit any mention of the temperature correlation. Option B. Report the individual VOC emission readings for each month, stating that all readings were within the permitted limits, and therefore no further action is required based on the collected data. Option C. Highlight the statistically significant correlation between ambient temperature and increased VOC emissions, noting that while current readings are within permit limits, the trend indicates a potential risk of future noncompliance under warmer conditions, recommending an investigation into the abatement system's performance curve and potential upgrades. Option D. Recommend an immediate shutdown of the specific exhaust stack until the abatement technology can be completely re-engineered, based on the observed correlation, without providing specific context or justification beyond the statistical relationship. The correct answer is C. Highlight the statistically significant correlation between ambient temperature and increased VOC emissions, noting that while current readings are within permit limits, the trend indicates a potential risk of future noncompliance under warmer conditions, recommending an investigation into the abatement system's performance curve and potential upgrades. Explanation. The core principle of data analysis within an environmental audit report, as guided by ISO 14014-2003, is to provide a clear, objective, and evidence-based foundation for conclusions and recommendations. This involves systematically examining collected audit findings to identify trends, patterns, and the significance of deviations from established criteria. The analysis should not merely present raw data, but should interpret it in the context of the audit objectives, the auditee's environmental policy, legal requirements, and best practices. For instance, if an audit of a manufacturing facility reveals a consistent upward trend in wastewater discharge parameters exceeding permitted limits over several reporting periods, the analysis must highlight this trend, quantify its magnitude, and assess its potential environmental impact and compliance implications. This analytical process directly supports the determination of the audit's findings and contributes to the overall assessment of the auditee's environmental management system. The analysis should also consider the reliability and sufficiency of the data collected to ensure the validity of the conclusions drawn. It is crucial that the analysis process is documented to allow for verification and understanding by the report recipient. The goal is to translate raw observations into meaningful insights that inform decision-making and drive continuous improvement in environmental performance. Question 2. When conducting an environmental audit according to ISO 14014-2003, and the audit team needs to gain a nuanced understanding of the implementation challenges and perceived effectiveness of a new waste reduction program within a manufacturing facility, which method of information gathering would be most appropriate for eliciting detailed qualitative insights and allowing for spontaneous clarification of responses? Option A. Observing the waste segregation process on the shop floor for a single shift. Option B. Distributing a comprehensive self-assessment questionnaire to all departmental supervisors. Option C. Conducting structured interviews with key personnel involved in waste management and production. Option D. Reviewing historical environmental performance data from the past 5 fiscal years. The correct answer is C. Conducting structured interviews with key personnel involved in waste management and production. Explanation. The primary purpose of interviews and questionnaires in environmental auditing, as guided by ISO 14014-2003, is to gather information from auditees to assess conformity with environmental policies, objectives, and legal requirements. While questionnaires can provide a broad overview and baseline data, interviews allow for deeper exploration, clarification of responses, and observation of nonverbal cues. The effectiveness of these tools hinges on their design and application. Well-crafted questions, whether written or verbal, should be open-ended where possible to encourage detailed responses, and specific enough to elicit relevant information. The audit team must ensure that the questions are relevant to the audit scope and criteria. For interviews, the auditor needs to establish rapport, actively listen, and probe for further details to gain a comprehensive understanding of the auditee's perspective and practices. This information then forms a crucial part of the evidence base for the audit report, informing findings and conclusions about the environmental management system's performance. The selection between questionnaires and interviews, or a combination thereof, depends on the audit objectives, the complexity of the subject matter, the availability of auditees, and the need for detailed qualitative data. Interviews are generally superior for understanding complex processes, motivations, and potential nonconformities that might not be apparent from written responses alone. Question 3. When preparing an environmental audit report for a manufacturing facility that has been assessed against the requirements of ISO 14001 and relevant national legislation such as the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act (RCRA) for hazardous waste management, what is the most critical quality control measure to ensure the report's integrity regarding the identification of nonconformities related to waste segregation and labeling? Option A. Verification that the report includes a comprehensive list of all personnel involved in the audit, along with their respective roles and responsibilities during the audit execution. Option B. A peer review of the report's narrative structure and clarity by another member of the audit team to ensure readability and adherence to standard reporting language. Option C. Confirmation that the report's executive summary accurately reflects the overall tone and sentiment of the audit findings, regardless of the specific details of individual nonconformities. Option D. A thorough review by a senior auditor to verify that all cited nonconformities are directly supported by documented evidence collected during the audit, cross-referenced with specific RCRA subpart requirements, and the facility's waste management plan. The correct answer is D. A thorough review by a senior auditor to verify that all cited nonconformities are directly supported by documented evidence collected during the audit, cross-referenced with specific RCRA subpart requirements, and the facility's waste management plan. Explanation. ISO 14014-2003, specifically in the context of audit reports, emphasizes the importance of ensuring the accuracy, completeness, and reliability of the information presented. Quality control within the auditing process, and subsequently in the report, is crucial for the credibility and utility of the audit findings. This involves a systematic review of the audit process and the resulting documentation to identify and correct errors or omissions. A key aspect of quality control for an audit report is the verification of the evidence gathered against the audit criteria. For instance, if an audit report cites a violation of a specific environmental regulation, such as the Clean Water Act discharge limits for a particular pollutant, the quality control process would involve cross-referencing the reported data with the actual monitoring results and the regulatory standards. The report must clearly state the audit objectives, scope, methodology, and the findings, supported by objective evidence. The review process should ensure that conclusions drawn are logical and directly supported by the evidence presented. This includes checking for consistency in language, adherence to reporting templates, and the proper articulation of nonconformities and recommendations. The aim is to produce a report that is unambiguous, factually correct, and provides a fair representation of the environmental management system's performance relative to the audit criteria. A robust quality control mechanism ensures that the audit team has exercised due professional care, and that the report serves its intended purpose of informing management and facilitating improvement. Question 4. During an environmental audit of a manufacturing facility, an auditor conducting a site inspection observes that employees at a particular assembly line are not consistently segregating different types of chemical waste into designated containers. Despite the company's documented environmental policy and procedure manual, clearly outlining the mandatory segregation requirements for hazardous materials. The auditor also notes the absence of readily accessible copies of these procedures at the immediate work area. Considering the principles of evidence gathering for an audit report according to ISO 14014-2003, what is the most appropriate immediate action for the auditor to take regarding this observation? Option A. Focus solely on reviewing the company's overarching waste management policy and its compliance with national environmental protection regulations, disregarding the specific operational inconsistencies observed on the assembly line. Option B. Immediately provide verbal feedback to the line supervisor, instructing them to rectify the waste segregation practices and demanding a written explanation for the deviation. Option C. Conclude that the environmental management system is ineffective for waste handling at this location and recommend a complete overhaul of the waste management plan in the audit report. Option D. Document the observation as a potential nonconformity, detailing the observed practice, its location, and the absence of adherence to documented procedures and legal requirements for waste segregation. Correct answer is D. Document the observation as a potential nonconformity, detailing the observed practice, its location, and the absence of adherence to documented procedures and legal requirements for waste segregation. Explanation: the core principle of a site inspection within an environmental audit, as guided by ISO 14014-2003, is to gather direct evidence of the auditee's environmental management system's implementation and its adherence to specified criteria. This involves observing practices, reviewing records in situ, and interviewing personnel. When a discrepancy is noted, such as a lack of documented procedures for waste segregation at a specific processing station, the auditor's primary responsibility is to confirm the actual practice against the documented system and any relevant legal requirements. Most effective way to address this is by documenting the observation as a potential nonconformity or finding, clearly stating what was observed, where it was observed, and the absence of supporting documentation or adherence to expected standards. This observation then forms a basis for further investigation and analysis in the audit report. The auditor should not, at this stage, assume the cause or immediately propose a corrective action, as that is the auditee's responsibility. The goal of the inspection is evidence collection, not problem solving during the audit itself. Therefore, recording the observed deviation from the expected environmental management system's implementation, including the lack of supporting evidence at the point of observation, is the critical step. This aligns with the requirement for factual and evidence-based reporting in environmental audits. Question 5. Consider an environmental auditor evaluating a manufacturing plant's adherence to a regional ordinance limiting volatile organic compound (VOC) emissions to a maximum of /50 parts per million ppm per hour. The audit plan specifies monthly grab samples from the primary exhaust stack. During the audit, the auditor finds records of only 3 grab samples taken over the past year, all of which registered /45 ppm. However, a continuous emissions monitoring system, SEMS, that was installed 6 months prior and is regularly calibrated according to manufacturer specifications, shows an average hourly VOC emission rate of /52 ppm over the same 6-month period, with peaks occasionally exceeding /60 ppm. Given this information, how should the auditor primarily address the discrepancy between the grab sample data and the SEMS data in the audit report, focusing on the sufficiency and appropriateness of evidence? Option A. Conclude that the evidence is contradictory and insufficient to draw any definitive conclusion on compliance, recommending an entirely new set of audits with enhanced sampling protocols. Option B. Conclude that the grab sample data, being within the limit, is appropriate evidence of compliance, and the SEMS data is anomalous and should be disregarded due to its higher readings. Option C. Determine that the SEMS data, representing a more continuous and potentially representative measure, is more appropriate evidence, and the limited grab samples are insufficient to confirm compliance, thus concluding a likely noncompliance. Option D. Acknowledge the grab sample data as sufficient and appropriate evidence of compliance, while noting the SEMS data as potentially indicative of an issue requiring further investigation by the auditee. Correct answer is B. Conclude that the grab sample data, being within the limit, is appropriate evidence of compliance, and the SEMS data is anomalous and should be disregarded due to its higher readings. Explanation: the sufficiency and appropriateness of audit evidence are paramount in environmental auditing, as guided by ISO 14014-2003. Sufficiency refers to the quantity of evidence, meaning enough evidence must be gathered to support the audit findings and conclusions. Appropriateness relates to the quality of evidence, ensuring it is relevant, reliable, and objective. When an auditor encounters a situation where initial evidence appears insufficient or questionable, the auditor must exercise professional judgment to determine if further evidence is needed or if the existing evidence, while potentially limited, can still support a finding if it is sufficiently relevant and reliable. For instance, if an audit of a facility's compliance with local wastewater discharge regulations, e.g., hypothetical regulation requiring less than /10 mg/L of suspended solids, reveals only one sample taken over a 6-month period, this might be considered insufficient in quantity. However, if that single sample was collected under representative conditions, is analyzed by an accredited laboratory, and shows /5 mg/L of suspended solids, the appropriateness of that single piece of evidence might be high. The auditor's task is to assess if this single, appropriate data point, despite its limited quantity, can support a conclusion regarding compliance for that specific period, or if additional sampling is required to establish a pattern or trend, thereby ensuring the overall evidence base is both sufficient and appropriate to support the audit report's conclusions. The objective is to gather enough relevant and reliable information to form sound audit conclusions, without over-relying on a single piece of evidence or dismissing evidence that, while limited in quantity, possesses high quality and relevance. Question 6. Consider a situation where an environmental auditor, conducting an audit of a manufacturing facility, uncovers a serious violation of the Clean Water Act. A local environmental advocacy group, having heard rumors of potential issues at the facility, directly contacts the auditor requesting specific details about any water pollution findings. The auditor is bound by the confidentiality provisions outlined in ISO 14014-2003 guidelines for environmental auditing audit reports. What is the auditor's most appropriate course of action regarding the advocacy group's request? Option A. Refer the advocacy group to the auditee's public relations department, stating that all external communications must be handled through official company channels. Option B. Provide the advocacy group with a summary of the findings related to the Clean Water Act violation, citing the public interest in environmental protection. Option C. Directly disclose the specific details of the Clean Water Act violation to the advocacy group, asserting that such information is of public concern and therefore exempt from confidentiality. Option D. Inform the auditee about the advocacy group's request and seek their explicit consent before sharing any information, while also explaining the auditor's confidentiality obligations. Correct answer is D. Inform the auditee about the advocacy group's request and seek their explicit consent before sharing any information, while also explaining the auditor's confidentiality obligations. Explanation: the core principle of confidentiality in environmental auditing, as guided by ISO 14014-2003, dictates that sensitive information obtained during an audit must be protected from unauthorized disclosure. This protection extends to proprietary business data, trade secrets, and information that could be detrimental to the auditee's competitive position if revealed. The audit report itself, containing findings, conclusions, and recommendations, is also subject to this confidentiality. When an auditor needs to share audit-related information with external parties, such as regulatory bodies or parent companies, it must be done with explicit consent from the auditee, or when legally mandated. In the scenario presented, the auditor has discovered a significant noncompliance with the Clean Water Act. While this finding is critical, the auditor's obligation to maintain confidentiality means they cannot unilaterally disclose this information to a local environmental advocacy group without the auditee's permission or a clear legal requirement to do so. The advocacy group's request, while well-intentioned, does not constitute a legal mandate for disclosure. Therefore, the auditor must inform the auditee of the request and seek their authorization before any information is shared. If the auditee refuses, the auditor's primary recourse within the framework of confidentiality is to document the refusal and proceed according to the audit plan and any contractual agreements, which typically involve reporting to management and potentially the board of directors. The auditor's duty is to the audit process and the auditee's trust, balanced with legal obligations. Disclosing information without consent or legal basis would violate the ethical and professional standards of environmental auditing, potentially leading to legal repercussions for the auditor and their firm, and severely damaging the credibility of the auditing profession. The auditor's role is to facilitate improvement and compliance through the audit process, not to act as an enforcement agent for external stakeholders without proper authorization. Question 7. Consider a scenario where an environmental auditor, MS Anya Sharma, is assigned to audit a manufacturing facility. MS Sharma discovers that the facility's environmental manager, Mr. Vikram Singh, is her former university mentor, with whom she maintained a friendly, albeit infrequent, correspondence over the years. Mr. Singh was instrumental in shaping her early career understanding of environmental compliance. According to the principles of objectivity and impartiality as guided by ISO 14014-2003, what is the most appropriate course of action for MS Sharma to ensure the integrity of the audit process and the resulting audit report? Option A. MS Sharma should conduct the audit as planned, assuming her professional ethics are sufficient to overcome any personal connection. Option B. MS Sharma should proceed with the audit but make a special note in the audit report about her prior relationship with Mr. Singh. Option C. MS Sharma should ask Mr. Singh to appoint a different representative from his team to interact with during the audit. Option D. MS Sharma should withdraw from the audit to avoid any potential perception or reality of bias due to her past mentorship relationship with the environmental manager. The correct answer is D. MS Sharma should withdraw from the audit to avoid any potential perception or reality of bias due to her past mentorship relationship with the environmental manager. Explanation: the core principle of objectivity and impartiality in environmental auditing, as outlined in ISO 14014-2003, dictates that an auditor must conduct the audit without bias and present findings truthfully and accurately. This means avoiding any influence that could compromise the integrity of the audit process or its outcomes. When an auditor has a pre-existing relationship with the auditee, such as a close personal friendship or a past professional collaboration that was particularly positive or negative, it can create a perceived or actual conflict of interest. Such relationships can subconsciously or consciously affect the auditor's judgment, leading to a less thorough examination of certain areas, or a tendency to overlook or downplay nonconformities. Maintaining independence from the auditee's operations and management is paramount. This independence ensures that the auditor's conclusions are based solely on the evidence gathered during the audit and are not swayed by personal connections or a desire to maintain a favorable relationship. Therefore, when a significant personal or professional relationship exists, the auditor should recuse themselves from the audit to uphold the fundamental requirements of objectivity and impartiality, thereby safeguarding the credibility of the entire audit process and the reliability of the audit report. This ensures compliance with the spirit and letter of the ISO 14014 guidelines, which are designed to produce credible and trustworthy environmental audit reports that can be relied upon by stakeholders. Question 8. Consider an environmental audit of a manufacturing facility that has identified fluctuating levels of wastewater discharge exceeding permitted limits, particularly during periods of peak production. The audit report needs to effectively communicate these compliance issues and their potential root causes to both the plant's engineering team and the corporate sustainability committee. Which approach to incorporating visual aids would best align with the objectives outlined in ISO 14014-2003 for an audit report of this nature? Option A. Incorporate a heat map showing the geographical distribution of all environmental nonconformities identified across the facility, including minor housekeeping issues, to provide a holistic overview of environmental management. Option B. Include a series of pie charts illustrating the proportion of different types of pollutants found in the wastewater samples each month, without correlating this data to production schedules. Option C. Utilize a time series line graph to depict daily wastewater discharge volumes against the regulatory limit over the audit period, supplemented by a process flowchart highlighting the stages of wastewater treatment and identifying potential points of failure or inefficiency. Option D. Present a simple table listing the dates and measured discharge volumes that exceeded the limit, along with a brief textual description of the noncompliance. The correct answer is C. Utilize a time series line graph to depict daily wastewater discharge volumes against the regulatory limit over the audit period, supplemented by a process flowchart highlighting the stages of wastewater treatment and identifying potential points of failure or inefficiency. Explanation: the primary purpose of visual aids in an environmental audit report, as guided by ISO 14014/2003, is to enhance clarity and facilitate understanding of complex environmental data and findings. When presenting information such as emission levels or waste generation trends, visual aids like charts, graphs, and diagrams can distill large datasets into easily digestible formats. For instance, a line graph illustrating a trend in volatile organic compound (VOC) emissions over several quarters can more effectively convey compliance status and potential areas of concern than a table of raw numerical data. This is particularly important when the audit report is intended for a diverse audience, including management, regulatory bodies, and operational staff, who may have varying levels of technical expertise. The selection of an appropriate visual aid should be driven by the nature of the data being presented and the message the auditor intends to convey. For comparative data, bar charts are often suitable. For showing relationships between variables, scatter plots might be used. For illustrating a process or system, flowcharts are beneficial. The key is that the visual aid should accurately represent the data, be clearly labeled, and directly support the audit findings and conclusions without introducing ambiguity or misinterpretation. The standard emphasizes that visual aids should be integrated thoughtfully into the report to supplement, not replace, the textual narrative. They should add value by simplifying complex information, highlighting key trends, and making the audit findings more accessible and impactful, ultimately contributing to more informed decision-making regarding environmental performance. Question 9. An environmental auditor is tasked with assessing a manufacturing facility's compliance with local effluent discharge regulations, specifically concerning the concentration of heavy metals in wastewater. The auditor plans to conduct on-site observations. Which observation technique would be most effective in gathering objective evidence of potential noncompliance related to the discharge process itself, beyond just reviewing laboratory analysis reports of collected samples? Option A. Conducting interviews with plant operators to ascertain their understanding of the heavy metal discharge limits and their personal experiences with process variations. Option B. Analyzing the facility's environmental policy document to confirm its commitment to minimizing heavy metal discharge into waterways. Option C. Direct visual inspection of the wastewater treatment process, including monitoring of discharge points for visible anomalies, and observing operator adherence to documented operating procedures for effluent management. Option D. Reviewing historical maintenance logs for the wastewater treatment equipment to identify any recurring issues that might impact effluent quality. The correct answer is C. Direct visual inspection of the wastewater treatment process, including monitoring of discharge points for visible anomalies, and observing operator adherence to documented operating procedures for effluent management. Explanation: the core principle behind effective environmental audit observation techniques, as outlined in guidelines like ISO 14014, is the systematic gathering of evidence through direct sensory input and interaction. This involves not just passively looking but actively engaging with the audit subject. The auditor must be trained to identify relevant environmental aspects and potential nonconformities by observing processes, equipment, and behaviors. This requires a keen eye for detail, an understanding of the environmental management system being audited, and knowledge of applicable regulations, such as those governing hazardous waste disposal or air emissions, which might be referenced in the audit scope. For instance, an auditor might observe the labeling of chemical containers, the operational status of pollution control equipment, or the procedures for handling spills. The effectiveness of these observations is directly tied to the auditor's ability to translate what they see, hear, and sometimes even smell, e.g., unusual odors indicating a leak, into verifiable audit findings. The focus is on objective evidence that can be corroborated. Therefore, a technique that emphasizes structured inquiry and detailed recording of what is directly perceived, while remaining open to unexpected findings, is paramount. This structured approach ensures that observations are relevant to the audit objectives and contribute to a comprehensive assessment of the environmental management system's performance and compliance. Question 10. During an environmental audit of a manufacturing facility operating under the stringent regulations of the European Union's Industrial Emissions Directive, the audit team identifies that the facility's wastewater treatment process consistently discharges effluent that, while meeting the specified concentration limits for individual pollutants, as per Annex Roman III of the directive, exhibits a combined ecotoxicity effect that is subtly impacting the receiving water body, an effect not explicitly detailed in the discharge permit's concentration-based parameters. How should the audit report objectively address this finding to comply with ISO 14014/2003 guidelines? Option A. Record the finding as a minor observation, suggesting the facility conduct further internal research into combined ecotoxicity effects without mandating immediate corrective action, as the facility is technically compliant with the listed discharge parameters. Option B. Document the observation as a significant nonconformity against the spirit of the Industrial Emissions Directive and the precautionary principle, citing relevant scientific literature on combined ecotoxicity effects and providing detailed evidence of the observed impact on the receiving water body, while clearly stating that this goes beyond the current permit's specific concentration limits. Option C. Omit the finding from the report, as the facility is in strict compliance with all stated permit conditions, and no specific regulatory clause addresses combined ecotoxicity in this manner. Option D. Qualify the finding as a potential issue requiring future regulatory amendment, focusing solely on the facility's adherence to current, explicit permit limits, and deferring any discussion of broader environmental impact to a separate, specialized ecological assessment. The correct answer is B. Document the observation as a significant nonconformity against the spirit of the Industrial Emissions Directive and the precautionary principle, citing relevant scientific literature on combined ecotoxicity effects and providing detailed evidence of the observed impact on the receiving water body, while clearly stating that this goes beyond the current permit's specific concentration limits. Explanation: the core principle of objective reporting in environmental auditing, as guided by ISO 14014/2003, is to present findings and conclusions based on verifiable evidence and without personal bias. This involves a rigorous process of data collection, analysis, and interpretation. The audit report must clearly distinguish between factual observations, identified nonconformities, opportunities for improvement, and the auditor's professional judgment. When presenting findings, the report should reference specific audit criteria such as regulatory requirements, e.g., the Clean Air Act in the United States or the Waste Framework Directive in the European Union, organizational policies, or the environmental management system's own procedures. The report should avoid subjective language, assumptions, or speculative statements. For instance, instead of stating the facility is likely polluting the river, an objective report would state effluent discharge samples collected on date from outfall number exceeded the permitted limit for specific pollutant as defined in regulatory citation by amount. Furthermore, the report should detail the evidence supporting each finding, which could include documentation review, interviews, site observations, and measurement data. The process of ensuring objectivity involves internal review by the audit team, and potentially by an independent party, to confirm that the report accurately reflects the audit evidence and is free from undue influence or personal opinions. This meticulous approach ensures the report is credible, actionable, and serves its intended purpose of driving environmental performance improvement. Question 11. When conducting an environmental audit against the requirements of ISO 14001, an auditor observes a significant deviation from documented procedures concerning hazardous waste segregation. The auditor notes that containers are not clearly labeled according to the organization's internal policy, which itself is intended to align with the Hazardous Waste Manifest requirements of the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act (RCRA). The auditor also interviews the waste management personnel who express confusion regarding the specific labeling protocols. Which of the following best characterizes the evidence required to substantiate an audit finding of nonconformity in this scenario, as guided by ISO 14014/2003? Option A. Photographic evidence of improperly labeled waste containers. Documented interviews with personnel demonstrating a lack of understanding of the labeling procedure, and a comparison of the observed labeling against the documented internal policy and relevant RCRA regulations. Option B. The auditor's personal belief that the labeling was inadequate based on prior experience with other facilities, without specific documentation or corroboration. Option C. A general statement from the auditor that the waste segregation process appeared disorganized and potentially noncompliant with RCRA. Option D. A summary of the organization's environmental policy that mentions the importance of proper waste management, without detailing specific nonconformities observed. The correct answer is A. Photographic evidence of improperly labeled waste containers, documented interviews with personnel demonstrating a lack of understanding of the labeling procedure, and a comparison of the observed labeling against the documented internal policy and relevant RCRA regulations. Explanation. The core principle of an audit finding, as delineated in ISO 14014/2003, is that it must be supported by sufficient, reliable, relevant, and useful evidence. This evidence forms the bedrock upon which any conclusion about conformity or nonconformity with audit criteria is built. Without verifiable evidence, an audit finding is merely an opinion or an unsubstantiated claim, lacking the rigor required for effective environmental management system auditing. The evidence must be objective, meaning it can be verified by others, and directly related to the audit criteria being assessed. For instance, if an audit criterion relates to compliance with the Clean Water Act discharge limits, the evidence would need to be actual water quality monitoring data, permits, and regulatory reports, not just a statement from a facility manager. The quality and sufficiency of this evidence are paramount for the audit report to be credible and actionable, enabling informed decision-making and corrective actions. Question 12. In the context of an environmental audit report prepared according to ISO 14014/2003, how should an auditor present an observation regarding a perceived lack of employee engagement with the organization's environmental policy, based on informal conversations and general atmosphere, rather than specific documented instances of noncompliance? Option A. Include the observation as a definitive conclusion about employee behavior, without any qualification regarding its subjective nature. Option B. Note the observation as a potential area for improvement, clearly stating it is based on informal discussions and general impressions, and suggest further investigation through employee surveys or structured interviews. Option C. Record the observation as a direct finding of non-compliance with the environmental policy, citing the informal conversations as primary evidence. Option D. Omit the observation entirely from the report to maintain a focus solely on documented, objective evidence of non-compliance. The correct answer is B. Note the observation as a potential area for improvement, clearly stating it is based on informal discussions and general impressions, and suggest further investigation through employee surveys or structured interviews. Explanation. ISO 14014/2003, in its guidance on environmental auditing, emphasizes the importance of the audit report in communicating findings. The report serves as the primary record of the audit and its outcomes. A critical aspect of an effective audit report is the clear distinction between factual findings, which are objective and verifiable, and subjective interpretations or opinions. Subjective evidence, while potentially valuable for context or identifying areas for further investigation, must be presented with caution and clearly identified as such. This is because subjective evidence, such as a manager's stated belief about the effectiveness of a process or an auditor's impression of a facility's environmental culture, lacks the direct, verifiable support that objective evidence provides. Objective evidence might include documented procedures, monitoring data, regulatory compliance records, or direct observations of nonconformities. When subjective evidence is included, it should be presented in a manner that acknowledges its nature, perhaps by attributing it to a specific individual or noting it as an observation that warrants further exploration rather than a definitive finding of noncompliance. This ensures the report maintains its credibility and supports sound decision-making by the auditee. The report should facilitate understanding and action, not introduce ambiguity. Question 13. Consider an environmental audit of a manufacturing facility subject to the Clean Water Act, where the auditor is tasked with verifying compliance with wastewater discharge limits for a specific heavy metal. The auditor observes that the facility's discharge volume fluctuates significantly throughout the day due to batch processing, which sampling approach would most effectively support a reliable conclusion regarding the facility's compliance with the stipulated daily average discharge limits, as detailed in the Audit Report Guidelines of ISO 14014-2003. Option A. Collect a single, large composite sample at the end of the audit period to represent the entire day's discharge, assuming this will average out any fluctuations. Option B. Implement a stratified sampling plan, collecting samples at predetermined intervals across different operational shifts and discharge volume periods to capture the variability. Option C. Conduct grab sampling only during the peak discharge hours, as this represents the highest potential for non-compliance. Option D. Rely solely on the facility's internal monitoring data without conducting any independent sampling, provided the data appears consistent. The correct answer is B. Implement a stratified sampling plan, collecting samples at predetermined intervals across different operational shifts and discharge volume periods to capture the variability. Explanation: the core principle of sampling in environmental auditing, as guided by ISO 14014-2003, is to select a representative subset of data or activities that accurately reflects the entire population being audited. This selection process must be systematic and justifiable, ensuring that the findings derived from the sample can be reliably extrapolated to the whole. When an auditor encounters a situation where a specific environmental parameter, such as the concentration of a particular pollutant in wastewater discharge, is being assessed, the method of sampling directly influences the validity of the audit findings. If the sampling plan is biased, for instance, by only collecting samples during periods of known low discharge, the audit report might incorrectly conclude that the facility is consistently in compliance with regulations like the Clean Water Act, even if peak discharges exceed permitted levels. Therefore, the auditor must document the sampling methodology, including the rationale for the chosen sample size and the criteria for sample selection, e.g., random sampling, stratified sampling based on operational shifts, or discharge variability. This documentation is crucial for demonstrating the thoroughness and integrity of the audit process and for supporting any conclusions drawn about the organization's environmental performance and compliance status. The audit report's credibility hinges on the defensibility of the sampling strategy employed. Question 14. Considering the guidelines within ISO 14014-2003 for environmental audit reports, what primary factors should dictate the retention period for audit documentation, including working papers and the final report, to ensure compliance and the audit's continued relevance? Option A. The organization's internal document retention policy, statutory and regulatory requirements, and the scope and complexity of the audit itself. Option B. The personal preference of the lead auditor and the availability of digital storage space within the organization. Option C. The perceived importance of the audit findings by senior management and the cost of archival storage solutions. Option D. The frequency of subsequent environmental audits and the potential for immediate follow-up actions by regulatory bodies. The correct answer is A. The organization's internal document retention policy, statutory and regulatory requirements, and the scope and complexity of the audit itself. Explanation: ISO 14014-2003, in its guidance on environmental audit reports, emphasizes the importance of retaining audit documentation for a defined period. This retention period is not arbitrarily set, but is influenced by several factors to ensure the audit's integrity, traceability, and usefulness for future reference and potential legal or regulatory scrutiny. Key considerations include the nature and scope of the audit, the specific environmental management system being audited, and any applicable statutory or regulatory requirements. For instance, environmental legislation in many jurisdictions mandates the keeping of records related to emissions, waste management, and compliance monitoring for a specified number of years. The audit report itself, along with supporting working papers, evidence collected, and follow-up actions, forms a crucial part of this record. The retention policy must strike a balance between the need for comprehensive record-keeping and the practicalities of storage and management, ensuring that the documentation remains accessible and relevant throughout its life cycle. Therefore, a robust retention policy is intrinsically linked to legal obligations and the long-term effectiveness of the environmental management system. Question 15. When evaluating the external review process for an environmental audit report conducted in accordance with ISO 14014-2003, which of the following actions by the external reviewer would most directly contribute to validating the report's adherence to the principles of objectivity and evidence-based findings, considering the context of potential regulatory compliance gaps identified in a facility operating under the Clean Water Act? Option A. Confirming the audit team's familiarity with the auditee's corporate social responsibility policies and ensuring the report's recommendations align with the organization's stated sustainability goals. Option B. Reviewing the audit plan to ensure it included a section on stakeholder engagement strategies for future environmental initiatives, irrespective of the current audit findings. Option C. Assessing the audit team's communication style and ensuring the report's language is constructive and motivational for the auditee's management team. Option D. Verifying that the audit team's conclusions regarding non-compliance with specific effluent discharge limits are directly supported by the documented sampling data, laboratory analysis results, and the auditee's own internal monitoring records, and confirming that the report clearly articulates the specific clauses of the Clean Water Act allegedly violated. Correct answer is D. Verifying that the audit team's conclusions regarding noncompliance with specific effluent discharge limits are directly supported by the documented sampling data, laboratory analysis results, and the auditee's own internal monitoring records, and confirming that the report clearly articulates the specific clauses of the Clean Water Act allegedly violated. Explanation. ISO 14014-2003 provides guidance on the reporting of environmental audits, with a significant focus on the external review process of the audit report. This process is crucial for ensuring the credibility and objectivity of the audit findings. The standard emphasizes that an external review should be conducted by individuals who are independent of the audit team and the auditee organization, and who possess the necessary expertise in environmental auditing and the subject matter of the audit. The purpose of this review is to assess the audit scope, methodology, findings and conclusions for accuracy, completeness, and adherence to the audit plan and relevant standards. It also verifies that the audit report is clear, concise, and supported by sufficient evidence. A key aspect of this external review is its role in validating the audit's conformity with the principles outlined in ISO 14010 and ISO 14011, which are foundational for environmental auditing. The review should also consider the auditee's perspective on the factual accuracy of the findings. The final report, after incorporating feedback from the external review and the auditee, should be formally issued. This process ensures that the audit report is a reliable document that can be used by stakeholders for decision-making and continuous improvement of the environmental management system. Question 16. Consider an environmental audit conducted at a manufacturing facility that utilizes various industrial solvents. The audit team discovers that the company is not maintaining records of the quantity of specific regulated solvents used on site, which is a requirement under the National Environmental Protection legislation regarding hazardous substance inventory reporting. The audit report needs to accurately reflect this finding. Which of the following statements best represents a compliant finding within the environmental audit report, adhering to the principles of ISO 14014-2003 for reporting compliance issues? Option A. The facility is not adhering to national legislation concerning hazardous substance inventory reporting, as evidenced by the absence of records detailing the quantities of regulated industrial solvents utilized on the premises. Option B. There is a general concern regarding the company's handling of industrial solvents, suggesting a need for improved environmental management practices. Option C. The audit team observed a lack of diligence in documenting solvent usage, which could impact the facility's overall environmental compliance posture. Option D. The company's management system for chemical tracking appears to be inadequate, potentially leading to future environmental liabilities. The correct answer is A. The facility is not adhering to national legislation concerning hazardous substance inventory reporting, as evidenced by the absence of records detailing the quantities of regulated industrial solvents utilized on the premises. Explanation. ISO 14014-2003 concerning guidelines for environmental auditing specifically addresses the content and structure of audit reports. A key element of these reports is the documentation of findings related to compliance with legal and other requirements. When an audit identifies a discrepancy between an organization's practices and a specific regulation, such as the EU's REACH, registration, evaluation, authorization and restriction of chemicals, regulation concerning the management of chemical substances, the audit report must clearly articulate this. The report should detail the specific requirement from REACH that is not being met, the observed practice that deviates from this requirement, and the potential environmental or health implications. The audit team's responsibility is to present factual evidence and conclusions, enabling the auditee to understand the nature and extent of the noncompliance. The report should also include recommendations for corrective actions. Therefore, a finding that accurately reflects a gap between the company's chemical handling procedures and the substance notification obligations under REACH, alongside an assessment of the associated risks, is a crucial component of a compliant audit report, according to ISO 14014-2003. This ensures transparency and provides actionable information for the auditee to rectify the situation and improve their environmental performance. The report's purpose is to inform and facilitate improvement, not to impose penalties. Question 17. Consider an environmental audit report for a manufacturing plant operating under the Clean Water Act. The audit team identified that the facility's wastewater treatment system, while generally compliant, occasionally experienced transient spikes in biochemical oxygen demand, BOD, during periods of high operational stress, leading to brief exceedances of the permitted discharge limit for those specific instances. The report needs to convey this finding to both the plant manager and the regional environmental regulatory agency. Which of the following approaches best exemplifies the principle of clear and concise language as advocated by ISO 14014-2003 for this specific finding? Option A. Wastewater discharge samples revealed that biochemical oxygen demand, BOD, readings occasionally exceeded the permitted limit of /30 text mg/L/ during peak production, a finding that requires immediate attention to prevent potential regulatory penalties. Option B. Was observed that the facility's effluent exhibited sporadic fluctuations in its biochemical oxygen demand, a phenomenon attributed to the inherent complexities of the manufacturing process, which may warrant a review of the operational parameters. Option C. The audit uncovered evidence suggesting that the wastewater treatment process may not be consistently optimized, as evidenced by occasional deviations in biochemical oxygen demand, which could have downstream environmental implications if not addressed. Option D. The wastewater effluent quality monitoring data indicated intermittent occurrences where the biochemical oxygen demand levels, due to operational flux, temporarily surpassed the stipulated concentration limits for a limited duration, necessitating further investigation into process variability. The correct answer is D. The wastewater effluent quality monitoring data indicated intermittent occurrences where the biochemical oxygen demand levels, due to operational flux, temporarily surpassed the stipulated concentration limits for a limited duration, necessitating further investigation into process variability. Explanation. The core principle of clear and concise language in an environmental audit report, as outlined by ISO 14014-2003, is to ensure that the findings, conclusions, and recommendations are readily understandable by all intended recipients. This involves avoiding jargon, technical terms that may not be universally understood by stakeholders, ambiguous phrasing, and overly complex sentence structures. The report should present factual information objectively and directly. For instance, instead of stating, the facility's effluent discharge parameters exhibited a discernible deviation from established regulatory thresholds, a clearer phrasing would be, the concentration of chemical X in the wastewater discharged exceeded the legal limit set by the Environmental Protection Agency. This directness ensures that the significance of the finding is immediately apparent and actionable. The goal is to facilitate informed decision-making by management and other relevant parties, ensuring that the audit serves its purpose of driving environmental improvement. The report's effectiveness is directly tied to its readability and the clarity with which its message is conveyed, impacting the promptness and accuracy of corrective actions taken. Question 18. When developing the information gathering instruments for an environmental audit focused on a manufacturing facility's adherence to the waste electrical and electronic equipment, WE directive and its internal hazardous waste management plan, what is the most critical consideration for the auditor when designing interview questions and questionnaires for plant operators and the environmental compliance officer? Option A. Prioritizing closed-ended questions that require simple yes/no answers to quickly ascertain basic compliance status with key WE directive articles and internal policy checkpoints. Option B. Designing questions that are highly technical and assume a deep understanding of chemical engineering principles, even for general plant operators. Option C. Focusing questions solely on the environmental compliance officer to obtain official statements, assuming plant operators have limited knowledge of regulatory requirements. Option D. Ensuring questions are open-ended to elicit detailed explanations of day-to-day waste handling procedures and potential challenges encountered, while also including specific, verifiable questions about record-keeping and disposal manifests. Correct answer is D. Ensuring questions are open-ended to elicit detailed explanations of day-to-day waste handling procedures and potential challenges encountered, while also including specific, verifiable questions about record-keeping and disposal manifests. Explanation: the core principle of effective environmental auditing, as guided by ISO 14014-2003, emphasizes gathering accurate and comprehensive information. Interviews and questionnaires are crucial tools for this purpose. When designing these instruments, the auditor must consider the specific objectives of the audit and the information needed to assess compliance with environmental legislation, organizational policies, and audit criteria. The selection of interviewees and respondents should be strategic, ensuring a range of perspectives from different levels and functions within the audited organization. The nature of the questions posed is paramount. They must be clear, unambiguous, and designed to elicit factual responses. Open-ended questions are generally preferred for interviews to encourage detailed explanations and uncover potential issues not anticipated by the auditor. For questionnaires, a mix of closed-ended questions for quantifiable data and open-ended questions for qualitative insights is often most effective. The process of developing these tools requires careful planning to ensure they are relevant to the audit scope, cover all necessary areas, and are presented in a manner that facilitates honest and complete responses, thereby contributing to the overall validity and reliability of the audit findings. The auditor's skill in formulating questions that probe for evidence of compliance or non-compliance, rather than simply seeking opinions, is critical. Question 19. Considering the principles outlined in ISO 14014-2003 for environmental audit reporting, how should an audit report address a finding of nonconformity where an organization's wastewater discharge exceeds the permissible limits set by a specific national environmental statute, such as the Water Framework Directive in the European Union, to effectively meet the diverse expectations of regulatory agencies, internal management, and local community representatives? Option A. Clearly state the specific clause of the Water Framework Directive that has been contravened, provide empirical data from the audit demonstrating the exceedance, outline the potential legal and reputational ramifications, and propose concrete, time-bound corrective actions with assigned responsibilities. Option B. Include a highly technical analysis of the chemical composition of the wastewater and complex statistical models predicting future discharge trends, without explicitly linking these to the specific regulatory violation or recommending direct corrective measures. Option C. Present the nonconformity as a minor procedural deviation requiring no immediate action, emphasizing the organization's overall good environmental record and focusing the report on positive aspects of the management system. Option D. Summarize the audit findings in general terms, focusing on the overall environmental management system effectiveness without detailing specific regulatory breaches or quantitative data, and suggest a broad review of operational procedures. The correct answer is A. Clearly state the specific clause of the Water Framework Directive that has been contravened, provide empirical data from the audit demonstrating the exceedance, outline the potential legal and reputational ramifications, and propose concrete, time-bound corrective actions with assigned responsibilities. Explanation: ISO 14014-2003 provides guidelines for environmental auditing, including the reporting of audit findings. A critical aspect of these reports is their ability to effectively communicate with various stakeholders, each having different interests and levels of technical understanding. When considering the reporting of nonconformities, the guideline emphasizes clarity and actionability. For instance, if an audit identifies a breach of a specific national regulation, such as the Clean Air Act in the United States, the audit report must clearly state the regulation, the specific clause or section violated, and the evidence supporting this finding. The report should then detail the implications of this nonconformity, which could include potential fines, legal liabilities, or damage to reputation. Crucially, the report must also propose corrective actions or recommendations for improvement. The effectiveness of the report in addressing stakeholder expectations hinges on its ability to translate technical audit findings into understandable and actionable information for each group. For regulatory bodies, the report serves as evidence of compliance or noncompliance. For management, it highlights risks in areas requiring operational changes. For the public or community groups, it offers transparency regarding the organization's environmental performance. Therefore, the reporting of a nonconformity should prioritize providing sufficient detail for verification and subsequent action, while also being accessible to a broad audience. This involves avoiding overly technical jargon where possible or providing clear definitions, and ensuring that the consequences and recommended remedies are explicitly stated. The ultimate goal is to facilitate informed decision-making and drive environmental improvement. Question 20. During the post-audit review meeting for an environmental management system audit conducted according to ISO 14014/2003 guidelines, the auditee representative for a manufacturing facility in a region with stringent wastewater discharge regulations, e.g., the European Union's Water Framework Directive, raises a pointed question regarding a nonconformity identified in the audit report concerning the facility's wastewater treatment logs. The auditee asserts that the log parameters, while deviating from internal targets, still remain within legally permissible discharge limits as stipulated by National Environmental Protection Agency mandates. How should the audit team appropriately address this specific concern within the context of the audit report's finalization? Option A. Reevaluate the nonconformity by cross-referencing the audit findings against the specific legal discharge limits and the organization's own environmental policy, noting any discrepancies or areas where internal targets are stricter than regulatory requirements, and revise the report if the finding is not a contravention of the audit criteria. Option B. Suggest the auditee initiate a separate internal review of their logging procedures, and then amend the audit report based on the outcome of that internal review, irrespective of the audit team's direct findings. Option C. Issue a formal clarification to the auditee stating that the audit was based on the organization's stated environmental policy and operational procedures, and that deviations from these, regardless of legal compliance, constitute a valid finding. Without further investigation, Option D. Immediately remove the nonconformity from the report, as the auditee has demonstrated compliance with legal discharge limits, which supersedes any internal targets or audit observations. The correct answer is A. Reevaluate the nonconformity by cross-referencing the audit findings against the specific legal discharge limits and the organization's own environmental policy, noting any discrepancies or areas where internal targets are stricter than regulatory requirements, and revise the report if the finding is not a contravention of the audit criteria. Explanation: ISO 14014/2003, specifically addressing audit reports, emphasizes the importance of clearly communicating findings and ensuring that all parties understand the audit's outcomes. When an auditee raises a question or concern regarding a specific finding during the report review phase, the audit team must address it promptly and professionally. This often involves a review of the audit evidence and methodology used to arrive at that particular finding. The standard implies that the audit report should be based on verifiable evidence, and that the audit process itself should be transparent. Therefore, if an auditee's concern points to a potential misunderstanding of the evidence or a deviation from the audit plan, the audit team's responsibility is to clarify the basis of the finding. This clarification process is crucial for maintaining the credibility of the audit and fostering a constructive relationship between the audit team and the auditee. The goal is not to concede to every point raised without justification, but to ensure that the report accurately reflects the audit's conclusions based on sound evidence and established auditing principles. The report itself should provide sufficient detail for such clarifications to be made, referencing the criteria against which the organization was audited and the evidence gathered. The process of addressing concerns is an integral part of the finalization of the audit report, ensuring its accuracy and acceptance by the auditee. Question 21. Consider a multi-site manufacturing organization that has just completed an internal environmental audit of its chemical handling and waste disposal practices at its primary production facility, located in a region with stringent environmental regulations mirroring the principles of the U.S. Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, (RCRA). The audit report contains findings related to minor nonconformities in record keeping and a potential for improvement in spill containment procedures. Which approach to controlling the distribution of this audit report best aligns with the principles outlined in ISO 14014/2003 for ensuring appropriate dissemination and action? Option A. Transmit the report directly to the Regional Environmental Regulatory Agency for their independent assessment and enforcement, without prior review by the organization's management. Option B. Provide the report exclusively to the lead auditor and the auditee's most junior environmental technician for review and potential follow-up actions. Option C. Distribute the report to the site environmental manager, the plant operations director, the corporate sustainability department, and the legal counsel responsible for environmental compliance, with a clear instruction that further dissemination requires explicit authorization. Option D. Release the report publicly on the company's intranet and send copies to all employees at the audited facility to foster transparency and encourage immediate corrective action. The correct answer is C. Distribute the report to the site environmental manager, the plant operations director, the corporate sustainability department, and the legal counsel responsible for environmental compliance, with a clear instruction that further dissemination requires explicit authorization. Explanation. The distribution of an environmental audit report is a critical step in ensuring its effectiveness and maintaining the confidentiality and integrity of the findings. ISO 14014/2003 provides guidelines for environmental auditing, and while it doesn't prescribe a rigid distribution matrix, it emphasizes the need for a controlled and appropriate dissemination of the report. The primary objective of controlled distribution is to ensure that the report reaches only those individuals and entities who have a legitimate need to know its contents, for purposes of decision-making, action planning, and regulatory compliance. This includes the auditee management, relevant internal departments, and potentially external regulatory bodies if mandated by law or agreement. Uncontrolled distribution, conversely, risks the misuse of sensitive information, potential misinterpretation by unqualified parties, and can undermine the audit process itself. Therefore, a systematic approach to identifying and managing recipients based on their roles and responsibilities concerning the audit findings is paramount. This involves establishing clear protocols for who receives the report, in what format, and under what conditions, thereby safeguarding the audit's purpose and the organization's interests. Question 22. When assessing the suitability of an individual to lead an environmental audit team for a facility manufacturing specialized petrochemicals, which factor, according to the principles outlined in ISO 14014/2003, is the most critical determinant of their qualification? Option A. Certification by an international auditing body as a lead auditor, regardless of specific industry experience. Option B. A minimum of 10 years of experience conducting general business process audits, with a recent 6-month introductory course on environmental regulations. Option C. Possession of a postgraduate degree in environmental engineering from a nationally recognized institution. Option D. Demonstrated ability to apply environmental management system principles and auditing methodologies, coupled with relevant industry knowledge and experience. Correct answer is D. Demonstrated ability to apply environmental management system principles and auditing methodologies, coupled with relevant industry knowledge and experience. Explanation. ISO 14014/2003, while providing guidelines for environmental auditing, does not explicitly mandate specific educational degrees or certifications for auditors. Instead, it emphasizes the importance of competence, which is a combination of knowledge, skills, and experience. The core principle is that an auditor must possess sufficient understanding of environmental management principles, auditing techniques, and the specific industry or regulatory context of the organization being audited. This competence ensures the audit is conducted effectively and produces reliable findings. Therefore, while formal qualifications can contribute to demonstrating competence, they are not the sole determinant. The ability to gather and analyze evidence, communicate effectively, and maintain professional skepticism are paramount. The standard stresses that the audit team's collective competence is key, allowing for a mix of specializations to cover all aspects of the audit scope. The focus remains on the auditor's capability to perform the audit tasks rather than on a prescribed list of academic achievements. Question 23. Consider a scenario where an environmental auditor, MS, Anya Sharma, is tasked with auditing a manufacturing facility that is a major supplier to a technology firm where her spouse is employed in a senior management position. While MS, Sharma has no direct reporting relationship to her spouse, and her audit scope is strictly limited to the manufacturing facility's compliance with the ISO 14001 standard. Potential for perceived or actual bias exists. Which of the following actions would best uphold the principles of objectivity and impartiality as outlined in ISO 14014, 2003 for MS Sharma in this specific situation? Option A. MS Sharma should disclose her spousal relationship to the auditee and the client commissioning the audit, and then recuse herself from conducting the audit to ensure absolute impartiality. Option B. MS Sharma should inform the auditing organization of her spousal relationship and request a reassignment to a different audit, even if it means delaying the audit schedule, to prevent any potential conflict of interest. Option C. MS Sharma should conduct the audit as planned but ensure that the audit report includes a disclaimer acknowledging her familial relationship, allowing the client to weigh the findings accordingly. Option D. MS Sharma should proceed with the audit, focusing solely on technical data and avoiding any interaction with personnel who might be aware of her personal connection, thereby maintaining professional detachment. The correct answer is A. MS Sharma should disclose her spousal relationship to the auditee and the client commissioning the audit, and then recuse herself from conducting the audit to ensure absolute impartiality. Explanation: the core principle of objectivity and impartiality in environmental auditing, as stipulated by ISO 14014, 2003, necessitates that an auditor's findings and conclusions are based solely on verifiable evidence and are free from undue influence or personal bias. This means that the auditor must not have any pre-existing relationships or vested interests in the auditee organization that could compromise their judgment. For instance, an auditor who is a former employee of the auditee or who stands to gain financially from a particular outcome of the audit would be considered compromised. Such a situation would violate the auditor's duty to present an unbiased assessment of the organization's environmental management system. The audit report, therefore, must reflect a fair and accurate representation of the auditee's performance against the established audit criteria, without any distortion or omission of facts due to personal connections or potential benefits. This commitment to independence ensures the credibility and trustworthiness of the audit process and its outcomes, which is crucial for driving genuine environmental improvement and compliance with regulations like the Clean Water Act or the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. Question 24. When disseminating the outcomes of an environmental audit conducted in accordance with ISO 14014, 2003 to a diverse group of external stakeholders, including regulatory agencies, community representatives, and potential investors, which communication strategy best facilitates understanding and engagement across these varied audiences? Option A. Presenting a series of highly technical presentations tailored exclusively for environmental professionals within each stakeholder organization, assuming a shared level of expertise. Option B. Releasing a series of press releases that focus solely on positive findings and avoid mentioning any areas for improvement or nonconformities identified during the audit. Option C. Distributing the full, unedited audit report, including all raw data and detailed technical analyses, to every stakeholder group regardless of their technical background or specific interests. Option D. Disseminating a concise summary report that highlights key findings, significant observations, and actionable recommendations, with provisions for accessing more detailed technical annexes upon request. The correct answer is D. Disseminating a concise summary report that highlights key findings, significant observations, and actionable recommendations, with provisions for accessing more detailed technical annexes upon request. Explanation: ISO 14014, 2003, in its guidance on environmental auditing, emphasizes the importance of clear and effective communication of audit findings to various stakeholders. The standard outlines that the audit report is the primary vehicle for this communication. When considering the dissemination of these findings, particularly to external parties who may not have direct involvement in the audit process itself but have a vested interest in the auditee's environmental performance, the report needs to be structured and presented in a manner that is both informative and accessible. This involves tailoring the level of detail and technical jargon to the audience. For instance, regulatory bodies might require specific technical data and compliance status, while investors might be more interested in the financial implications of environmental risks and opportunities identified. Community groups might focus on local environmental impacts and the organization's commitment to sustainability. Therefore, the most effective approach for communicating audit findings to a broad spectrum of external stakeholders who possess varying levels of environmental expertise and specific interests is to provide a comprehensive summary report. This summary should distill the key findings, significant observations, and recommendations into a format that is easily understood by non-specialists, while also offering access to more detailed technical annexes or supplementary reports for those who require in-depth information. This tiered approach ensures that the core messages are conveyed broadly, while still catering to the specific information needs of different stakeholder groups, thereby promoting transparency and informed decision-making without overwhelming those with less technical backgrounds. The aim is to facilitate understanding and engagement, fostering trust and accountability regarding the organization's environmental management system and performance. Question 25. Considering the stipulations within ISO 14014, 2003 regarding the content and purpose of an environmental audit report, what fundamental principle governs the retention period for supporting audit documentation, such as field notes and evidence logs, when the audit identified a potential violation of a national environmental regulation that carries a statute of limitations for prosecution? Option A. The retention period should be dictated by the statute of limitations for any potential legal or regulatory action arising from the audit findings, ensuring sufficient time for review and evidence preservation. Option B. The retention period should be determined solely by the internal audit department's preference for record management efficiency. Option C. The retention period should be aligned with the auditee's standard business record retention policies, even if those policies are shorter than any relevant legal or regulatory requirements. Option D. The retention period should be a fixed, universally applied duration of 5 years, regardless of the specific findings or regulatory context. Correct answer is A. The retention period should be dictated by the statute of limitations for any potential legal or regulatory action arising from the audit findings, ensuring sufficient time for review and evidence preservation. Explanation: ISO 14014, 2003, which provides guidelines for environmental auditing, emphasizes the critical role of documentation and record keeping in ensuring the integrity, transparency, and effectiveness of the audit process. The audit report is the primary output and must accurately reflect the audit findings, conclusions, and recommendations. Section 5.3 of ISO 14014, 2003 specifically addresses the content of the audit report, stating that it should include sufficient detail to enable the auditee to take corrective action. This includes clear descriptions of nonconformities, evidence supporting these findings, and specific recommendations for improvement. The guidelines also highlight the importance of maintaining supporting audit documentation, such as work papers, interview notes, and evidence collected, for a defined period. This documentation serves as a basis for the report, allows for review and verification, and supports the audit team's conclusions. The retention period for this documentation should be established based on organizational policies, legal and regulatory requirements, and the needs of stakeholders. For instance, if an audit identifies a nonconformity related to compliance with the Clean Air Act, the audit documentation and report would need to retain evidence of the specific emission limits, monitoring data, and the auditor's assessment of compliance for a period that allows for regulatory follow-up or potential legal challenges, which might extend for several years, depending on specific provisions within the Act or related enforcement actions. Therefore, the comprehensive nature of the audit report, supported by well-maintained records, is paramount for demonstrating due diligence and facilitating continuous environmental improvement. Question 26. When constructing an environmental audit report according to ISO 14014-2003, a critical requirement for the validity of any reported nonconformity is that it must be directly supported by what fundamental element of the audit process? Option A, stakeholder feedback on perceived issues. Option B, historical performance trends. Option C, expert opinion on best practices. Option D, verifiable, objective evidence. The correct answer is D, verifiable, objective evidence. Explanation: the core principle of evidence-based auditing, as espoused in guidelines like ISO 14014-2003, is the necessity for audit findings to be supported by verifiable information. This means that any conclusion drawn by an auditor must be directly traceable to objective evidence collected during the audit process. This evidence can take various forms, including documents, records, observations of activities and conditions, interviews with personnel, and measurements. The audit report, then, serves as the formal communication of these findings, and its credibility hinges entirely on the quality and relevance of the supporting evidence. If an auditor concludes that a particular environmental aspect is not being managed in accordance with stated procedures or regulatory requirements, this conclusion must be substantiated by specific examples of non-compliance or deviation. For instance, if the audit report states that waste segregation procedures are not being followed, the evidence presented would need to include specific instances observed during site visits, such as mixed waste streams in designated areas, or discrepancies noted in waste manifest records compared to actual disposal practices. Without this direct link between the finding and the supporting evidence, the audit finding lacks validity and cannot be acted upon effectively by the auditee. The report must clearly articulate the evidence that led to each finding, enabling the auditee to understand the basis of the assessment and implement appropriate corrective actions. This meticulous documentation ensures transparency and accountability in the environmental auditing process. Question 27. When preparing an environmental audit report in accordance with ISO 14014-2003, what is the primary strategic consideration for incorporating visual aids such as flowcharts or trend graphs into the document? Option A, to simplify and clarify complex environmental data or audit findings, thereby enhancing comprehension for a broad readership. Option B, to exclusively present statistical data and numerical outcomes, ensuring all quantitative aspects of the audit are visually represented. Option C, to increase the overall length and detail of the report, providing a more comprehensive overview of the audited environmental management system. Option D, to fulfill a specific requirement for visual representation mandated by the auditing standard for all identified nonconformities. Correct answer is A, to simplify and clarify complex environmental data or audit findings, thereby enhancing comprehension for a broad readership. Explanation: ISO 14014-2003, while not mandating specific visual aids, emphasizes clarity and conciseness in audit reports. The purpose of incorporating visual elements is to enhance the understanding of complex information, facilitate quicker comprehension of findings, and improve the overall readability of the report for a diverse audience, including management and stakeholders who may not be environmental specialists. Charts, graphs, and diagrams are effective tools for presenting quantitative data, trends, nonconformities, and the scope of the audit. For instance, a pie chart could illustrate the distribution of audit findings across different environmental aspects, while a trend line graph might depict the progression of a specific environmental performance indicator over time. The key consideration is that any visual aid must directly support the audit findings and conclusions, adding value rather than mere decoration. It should be clearly labeled, referenced within the text, and easy to interpret. The selection of a visual aid should be driven by the nature of the data and the message it needs to convey, ensuring it accurately reflects the audit's scope and outcomes, and adheres to the principle of clear communication as outlined in the guidelines. Therefore, the most appropriate use of visual aids in an environmental audit report, as per the spirit of ISO 14014, 2003, is to simplify and clarify complex environmental data or audit findings, making them more accessible to the report's recipients. Question 28. Consider an environmental audit of a chemical manufacturing facility that has developed a unique, highly efficient catalyst for a key production process. This catalyst significantly reduces waste byproducts and energy consumption, offering a substantial competitive advantage. During the audit, the team gains access to detailed technical specifications, experimental data, and cost-benefit analyses related to this catalyst. To uphold the principles of ISO 14014, 2003 regarding the handling of sensitive information, what is the most appropriate action concerning the audit report's content pertaining to this catalyst? Option A. Summarize the catalyst's benefits in broad terms, such as improved process efficiency, and provide the detailed technical data in a separate, unclassified addendum to the main report. Option B. Exclude all information related to the catalyst from the audit report to avoid any potential breach of confidentiality, even if it impacts the completeness of the environmental assessment. Option C. Detail the catalyst's chemical composition, operational parameters, and precise waste reduction figures, as this information is vital for a comprehensive environmental performance assessment. Option D. Include a general statement in the report acknowledging the existence of proprietary process improvements that contribute to environmental performance, without disclosing specific technical details or data related to the catalyst, and ensure the report is marked as confidential. Correct answer is D. Include a general statement in the report acknowledging the existence of proprietary process improvements that contribute to environmental performance, without disclosing specific technical details or data related to the catalyst, and ensure the report is marked as confidential. Explanation: the core principle of maintaining confidentiality in environmental auditing, as guided by ISO 14014, 2003, dictates that audit findings, information, and conclusions must be handled with discretion. This is crucial for fostering trust between the auditee and the audit team, and for ensuring the integrity of the audit process. When an audit team encounters sensitive proprietary information, such as a novel pollution control technology that provides a significant competitive advantage, the audit report must reflect this sensitivity. The guidelines emphasize that such information should not be disclosed to unauthorized parties. This includes preventing the leakage of details about the technology itself, its operational parameters, or its environmental performance benefits, which could be exploited by competitors or inadvertently revealed to the public without proper context or permission from the auditee. Therefore, the audit report should contain a clear statement acknowledging the confidential nature of specific data points or entire sections, and outline the measures taken to protect this information, such as limiting access to the report to essential personnel within the auditing organization and the auditee's management. This aligns with the broader ethical obligations of auditors to protect client information and maintain professional integrity. Question 29. Consider an environmental audit of a newly established chemical synthesis plant that utilizes several proprietary reagents and operates under stringent, evolving national emission standards. The audit team has minimal historical operational data for this specific facility. Which approach to risk assessment will be most effective in identifying potential areas of significant environmental concern and noncompliance with regulations like the Clean Air Act for this scenario? Option A. Prioritizing the review of only the most recently published environmental regulations and assessing the facility's current state against these standards without a forward-looking risk evaluation. Option B. Focusing the audit scope on historical compliance records from similar, but not identical, facilities in other regions to infer potential risks. Option C. Relying primarily on interviews with plant operators and supervisors to gauge their perception of potential environmental risks, as they possess direct operational knowledge. Option D. Conducting a detailed analysis of process flow diagrams, material safety data sheets, MSDS, for all chemicals, anticipated waste generation profiles, and preliminary emergency response procedures to identify potential failure modes and their environmental consequences. The correct answer is D. Conducting a detailed analysis of process flow diagrams, material safety data sheets, MSDS, for all chemicals, anticipated waste generation profiles, and preliminary emergency response procedures to identify potential failure modes and their environmental consequences. Explanation: the core principle of risk assessment within environmental auditing, as guided by ISO 14014/2003, is to identify and evaluate potential environmental impacts and the likelihood of their occurrence. This evaluation informs the audit's scope, focus, and the prioritization of findings. When considering a new facility with limited historical data and a complex manufacturing process involving novel chemical synthesis, the audit team must adopt a proactive and comprehensive approach to risk assessment. The primary objective is to anticipate potential nonconformities and significant environmental aspects before they manifest as actual incidents or breaches of regulatory requirements, such as those mandated by the Clean Water Act or the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act (RCRA). Therefore, the most effective strategy involves a thorough review of process design documents, anticipated waste streams, emergency response plans, and the inherent hazards of the chemicals used. This allows for the identification of potential failure points and the assessment of their potential environmental consequences and the probability of their occurrence. This proactive identification and evaluation are crucial for ensuring the audit's relevance and effectiveness in identifying potential environmental risks that might not be immediately apparent through routine operational checks. The focus is on forward-looking analysis rather than solely reactive examination of past events. Question 30. Consider an environmental audit of a manufacturing facility subject to regulations regarding air emissions, such as the Clean Air Act in the United States. The audit team identifies a potential issue where the facility's self-monitoring reports for volatile organic compounds, VOC, appear to show a trend of increasing emissions, approaching but not exceeding regulatory limits. The lead auditor reviews a sample of these reports and notes that some data entries are incomplete, lacking timestamps or specific calibration details for the monitoring equipment. Additionally, a brief conversation with the environmental manager indicates that the monitoring equipment has been experiencing intermittent calibration drift, which they are addressing. To form a conclusive finding on whether the facility is effectively managing its air emissions and adhering to the spirit of regulatory compliance, what combination of evidence would be considered both sufficient and appropriate according to the principles outlined in ISO 14014/2003. Option A. A single interview with the environmental manager confirming that the equipment issues are being resolved, and a review of the most recent 3 self-monitoring reports. Option B. A comprehensive review of all submitted self-monitoring reports for the past 2 years, cross-referenced with maintenance logs for the monitoring equipment, calibration records, and documented corrective actions taken by the facility to address the identified drift, along with site observations of the monitoring process. Option C. A collection of employee opinions regarding the perceived quality of air emissions and a review of only the self-monitoring reports that show emissions below the regulatory threshold. Option D. A formal request for the facility to submit a new set of self-monitoring reports for the next month, with the auditor relying solely on these future reports to assess compliance. The correct answer is B. A comprehensive review of all submitted self-monitoring reports for the past 2 years, cross-referenced with maintenance logs for the monitoring equipment, calibration records, and documented corrective actions taken by the facility to address the identified drift, along with site observations of the monitoring process. Explanation: the sufficiency and appropriateness of evidence are paramount in environmental auditing, as stipulated by ISO 14014/2003. Sufficiency refers to the quantity of evidence, meaning enough evidence has been gathered to support audit findings and conclusions. Appropriateness relates to the quality of evidence, ensuring it is relevant, reliable, and objective. When an auditor observes a potential nonconformance, such as a company not maintaining records of hazardous waste disposal, as required by local environmental regulations like the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA in the United States, they must collect evidence. This evidence needs to be both sufficient in quantity and appropriate in quality to form a sound conclusion. For instance, a single verbal statement from an employee might not be sufficient or appropriate on its own. However, a combination of documented waste manifests, company disposal logs, and corroborating statements from multiple personnel, all cross-referenced and verified for accuracy, would constitute sufficient and appropriate evidence. The auditor must consider the risk associated with the nonconformance. Higher risk areas demand more rigorous and comprehensive evidence. The appropriateness of evidence also hinges on its source and method of acquisition. First-hand observation and verifiable documentation are generally considered more appropriate than hearsay or uncorroborated claims. Therefore, the auditor's judgment is crucial in determining if the collected evidence meets these criteria to support their audit report's conclusions regarding compliance and the effectiveness of the environmental management system.